Welcome to the Slingshot. Today's special guest is Dr. David Berri. David is a professor of economics at Southern Utah University. He spent the last 2 decades researching sports and economics while publishing works on a variety of topics, including the evaluation of players and coaches, competitive balance, the drafting of players, labor disputes, the NCAA, and gender issue in sports. Dr. Berri was the lead author of the books The Wages of Wins and Stumbling on Wins, and published Sports Economics, a textbook for Macmillan Publishers in 2018. You got to slow down, David. You're going a little fast. He has a new book out called Slaying the Trolls, published by Kendall Hunt and co-authored with Nefertiti Walker of UMass's Eisenberg School of Management. David is also the author of some viral tweets on Caitlin Clark, in case you missed them, like the one on June 2nd, where he claimed, quote, "The narrative that Caitlin Clark is saving the WNBA is simply false. The league doubled its revenues in the 5 years before Clark showed up. That was during a pandemic, exclamation point." Welcome, David, to the Slingshot.
Glad to be here.
Yeah. And joining me today is my co-host, Darren Bush, who you may not know is a Kung Fu master, which qualifies Darren to ask David fun questions about sports economics. Welcome, Darren.
Welcome. Not a master, just a 4th degree black belt. But
that's what I was going to, 4th degree. So I'll never get in a fight with you about the consumer welfare standard, or at least not in person.
Well, I mean, you'll lose that for other reasons than physical prowess. But yeah, I'm looking forward to this. Got my game on, and as a Jazz fan, I'm all excited about talking to someone from Utah.
Nice. Well, today we're going to be discussing 3 topics. The first is David's new book, Slaying the Trolls. The second topic is Caitlin Clark and the WNBA. And the third topic is the role of the NCAA in promoting women's sports. So let's start right off, Slaying the Trolls. David, I really enjoy this book, and I want to give a little preview. You begin the book by describing the exploding popularity of professional women's soccer, much of which just happened in the last decade. And in just 3 years, I love this stat, 2020 to 2023, Deloitte estimates that the value of women's sports grew 300%. I don't think I missed a decimal there, 300%. What accounts for this meteoric rise?
Well, I think what's going on here is that for a very long time, women's sports couldn't happen. Men actively banned women from playing sports. And then when they finally said, okay, you can play sports, they didn't support them in any way whatsoever. And that really didn't start to change until the latter half of the 20th century. And if you go back and you look at men's sports history, and this is something that men do not understand. Men have a habit of thinking, they look at the world that exists right now, where the NBA is extremely popular and the NFL is extremely popular and Major League Baseball is extremely popular. And they're like, it was always like that. And no, it was not. When these leagues started, they had no fans. There was no fan base. There was nothing. And that was true of all sports. It takes a long time to build a fan base. And so what you're seeing right now is women's sports are reaching that point where now they've existed for several decades, and now they're starting to explode in popularity, just like men's sports, which tells us a fundamental story about sports. Sports are the same for women as they are for men. There is no men's sports are better than women's sports. That's ridiculous. Sports are good no matter who plays them. But the problem is that for a long time, men would look at women's sports and say, hey, there's no fans. Well, of course there are no fans. It hasn't existed before. How could there be fans? There were also no fans of men's sports when men's sports started. Major League Baseball attendance did not average 10,000 fans a game till we got to the 1940s. Babe Ruth was playing in front of nobody. People look at old film and they see Babe Ruth playing in the Yankee Stadium. Yeah, there were fans in New York, but they don't show the film of Babe Ruth playing around the country in front of nobody. The average attendance for like the St. Louis Browns is like 4,000 fans a game. Can you imagine 4,000 fans in a baseball stadium, what that looks like? That looks like nobody's there. You know, the thing seats 40,000 people. That means 90% of the seats are empty. There's nobody there. And, you know, and so people don't know that. They're like, well, there are always these huge numbers of fans. Bob Cousy put it this way about the Celtics. This is a fun story about early years of the NBA. Bob Cousy said, everyone remembers Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier. Do you know that a few years after that, we broke the color barrier in the NBA? You know why you don't know that? Because nobody cared about the NBA. They didn't care what color we were. There was nobody there watching us. So it didn't make any difference.
It's a great one. Well, let me ask you this, because the title of the book, Slaying the Trolls, raises the question in my mind, who are these trolls, right? Who are the trolls in the book's file? You mentioned these folks. I know them because, I read sports. I watch ESPN, but Skip Bayless in chapter 2, Rob Nyer in chapter 3, Clay Travis in chapter 4. I don't know if people outside of kind of the sports bubble, and particularly our listeners, are going to know who these guys are. Can you tell us who they are, and why can't the trolls just ignore what's happening in women's sports? What do they have to weigh in for?
Well, there's a lot of men who are extremely threatened by women playing sports. They get very, very upset. And when we actually were writing this book, we weren't necessarily thinking of Clay Travis, although Clay Travis is very much a troll. What we were thinking of is, and you see this on social media, if somebody mentions the WNBA or women's sports, immediately there will be men will show up making the same comments over and over and over again. Nobody watches the WNBA. It doesn't make a profit. There are no fans. The NBA subsidizes this. They say the same things over and over and over again. And it just is ad nauseum. Now the trolls, these online people, they get their talking points from other people in the media like Clay Travis. Clay Travis did say, and we note this at the very beginning of the book in the preface, he does say, as recently as last year, during the WNBA finals between the Liberty and the Aces, he said there are no fans of the WNBA while they were getting something like 15,000 fans showing up for the finals. He was saying, there are no fans. Well, clearly there are fans. We have video. We can see them. So what do you mean? What are you talking about? So they say that. They say things like that. They also say things, and this is one that I come back to again and again. They'll say the WNBA doesn't make a profit. There is no evidence that that's true other than the NBA asserting it. And this is something that as academics, I think academics would find this pretty easy to refute. Non-academics seem okay with this. But I was at an academic conference yesterday presenting two studies that I did. When you do a study and you put forward evidence, the other academics ask the question, is that really true? Is it true? How do you know that's true? Maybe if you looked at it this way, that wouldn't be true. And they always are questioning, I don't know how you know that that's actually true. That's what academics do. It's not true if you don't have evidence. If you have no evidence, it's just an assertion, and an assertion doesn't count. What has happened in the history of NBA basketball and in the WNBA, and this goes back 50 years or so ago, the NBA learned this, that the way to do labor negotiations is to assert that there are no profits. I don't make any money. I can't pay you. I got no money. Now, as academics, we're like, you got no money? Well, show me you got no money. Is there any proof of that? I'm not showing you that. But then it doesn't count. See, that doesn't count. You can't just assert it. You got to have evidence. So the NBA said this for years about the NBA. And they said this as recently as 2016. They said half the NBA teams don't make a profit. And you're like, really? It's a multi-billion-dollar league. How are you not making a profit on this? This is a league that's heavily subsidized by the government. How do you not make a profit on this? This is ridiculous. Are you the worst businessmen on the planet? How can you not make a profit? And they learned that. And then when the WNBA came along, and the NBA owns about half of that league, they used the same playbook. WNBA doesn't make a profit. Why aren't you paying the WNBA players better? We don't make a profit. There's no profit. And then I come along and say, how do you know that? How do I know that you... when I was writing at Forbes, I got in trouble with an editor because I wrote the sentence, the NBA asserts that the WNBA does not make a profit. And my editor said, you can't say that. Why not? That's all that happened. They asserted something. And my editor said, sounds like you think they're lying. I said, no. If I said they were lying, I would have said the NBA thing about the WNBA. See, that would be the statement. I didn't say that. I said the NBA asserts. Yeah, but people interpret that as you think they're lying. I don't care what I'm just saying, I am saying the actual truth about what they said.
An editor would never tell you that at the Sling, David. I just want you to be assured. Darren, why don't you take over?
Yeah, I mean, so you actually raised an interesting point because it's pretty classic labor, labor negotiation strategy. After the stock buybacks and the CEO and the CEO pay, we just don't have any money. I am so sorry that we don't have any money for you all.
What's weird is that these trolls totally buy that. And I've said this on Twitter also. I said the trolls must be the cheapest people on the planet to hire. I said everyone should hire these people because clearly you can pay them nothing. All you have to do is say, I got no money. And the trolls will go, oh, I was expecting a paycheck this week, but you got no money. Well, okay, I'm working for free then. I'm so sorry. I don't even know why I thought there'd be a paycheck. That's their argument. That makes no sense.
Well, see, so I have a question about the level of trolling, because there are some trolls out there like who perpetuate those myths about women's sports. Comedians like Bill Burr, they've targeted he's targeted the WNBA. That's picked up popular press. And Michael Che on Saturday Night Live had Caitlin Clark on recently after making lots of snarky comments about the WNBA. And it gets also picked up on social media. Like TikTok has that constant perpetual discussion about John McEnroe talking about Serena Williams. So I mean, are these also levels of troll?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's very, men are very, and I taught gender economics, so this goes beyond sports. Men are very comfortable attacking what women do. It's considered socially acceptable if they get to do that. Oddly enough, if you reverse it and you attack them, they cry a lot. They're very sad if you attack them and say, hey, there's something wrong with why you're doing that. Maybe there's a problem with you. And then they cry, they go, hey, you're canceling me. And you're like, dude, I'm just saying that you're wrong. Oh, no, you're canceling me. Oh, what? You mean you get to do it one way, but doesn't go the other way? No, it's like, okay. So I once, this is a related troll comment. This is not on women's sports, but I did this once on social media. We've all heard this. Older professors say that students today are entitled and that they say that a lot. And that there's no free speech anymore because students can't handle the truth or something like that. And I responded to a guy who said something like that. And I said something to the effect that perhaps you're completely out of touch and you're an idiot. And he got really mad at me. He was like really upset. How dare you say that to me? You mean words make you feel bad? That's insane. That's crazy talk.
Well,
I can't imagine.
Well, back in our day, when we were, going to school uphill in the snow, both ways, both, there and back, we had to tough it out. And they called us idiots because they just knew better. No, just kidding.
That's a story. That's a story all these older professors say. And I tell my students this because I grew up in the 70s and 80s. And now I'm at the age of the old people when I was growing up who would say stuff about the 30s. So now I'm seeing people who look like those people, and they're saying stuff about back in our day. I'm like, back in your day was 1975. What the hell are you talking? People were on drugs. What world are you coming from? You didn't grow up in 1925. Dude, right. You're not 150. What are you doing? I know what was going on. That wasn't happening. So, but this is the thing: is that women? This is the thing about women's sports. Is part of the issue is women's sports haven't had the same time that men's sports have had. But the other issue is that women face this big barrier from men who just don't. This is something that women have noted. There are lots of sports I don't like, that I don't watch. Right? How much do I talk about them? I don't care. Okay, I'm not a big fan of car racing. The number of times I talk about on social media about car racing is zero. If you like car racing, great. You like car racing. I don't, so I don't talk about it. Men can't do that. There are so many men who are like, I don't like women's sports. I need to tell you that I don't care. And people are like, but how can you say you don't care? You're taking the time to say you don't care. Clearly you care. and they're really upset about it. It makes them very unhappy because in their mind, this is the mind of a lot of male sports fans, sports is their domain. It's the one thing they feel like it's just theirs. And the reality is it's never been just theirs. Women have played sports forever. And women are sports fans. This is something that we start off the book noting, is that when they do Gallup surveys and they say, are you a sports fan? Something like 50% of women say yes. Something about 2/3 of men say yes. Um, and we point out in the book, that does mean that 1/3 of men are not sports fans. And that means half of women, of course, are not sports fans. But the way the stereotypes work is that men are told that they're supposed to be sports fans. So we end up with this scenario where we know that men do this. They go to some sort of social gathering, there's a sporting event, and then they just pretend. Super Bowl's on. Yay! That's fantastic. I'm rooting blue team good. I don't know. And so they pretend. They fake it. Women, on the other hand, are forced to do it the other way. And we talk about this in the book. And I got introduced to this by a student of mine at SUU. I helped create this little website called the Ladies League, where I would have women write about sports the way they wanted to write about sports. And I said that this is what's missing in the social media. And I started this with some students. And the first student to write, she wrote this really interesting column where she talked, and she did it in a very clever way, that she talked about this idea that there's a quiz, that when women say they're a sports fan to a man will frequently come back with a quiz. So if she says she was a Cowboys fan, she tells a man, I'm a Cowboys fan. His response is, who was the starting left guard on the Cowboys team that won Super Bowl in 1978?
Yeah.
Why the hell would I know that? Why the hell do we care? And what the hell does that do with anything? It's like the men are like, I don't believe you're a sports fan, so I'm going to put this barrier in front of you.
Well, that raises a couple of points, because it's a kind of a no true Scotsman argument. No true Scotsman would not know this, right?
Yes.
The other thing I should point out is, I mean, obviously we're talking about women in sports, and we're three men. That is not for folks in the audience. That is not for a lack of trying to get some other voices on the Slingshot. So, but we're still happy to have you. So, yeah. Those administrative positions take up a lot of time. So you have this book chapter called "Reverse Sexism Does Not Exist," and I know that's not a shock. But I'm wondering, so if you're going to get I imagine you're getting a lot of pushback from that already, from men going, "What are you talking about? There's all sorts of reverse sexism." So, what's the argument?
Well, the argument is that, this is actually an academic argument to begin with, is that you can be prejudiced, but sexism requires that you have power. If you don't have any power, then you can't be sexist. You can't be sexist. Sexism and racism requires that you have power.
David, did you take that? Did you take that from antitrust? You can't inflict anti-competitive injury unless you have market power. Did you get that?
Something like that. Okay. That's not but it is a very similar argument. But the argument that we apply to sports is that what people say is that when Title IX comes along, men's sports get eliminated in colleges in order to allow women to play sports. And athletic directors will actually say this: I am going to be cutting men's gymnastics because we got to have equality, and the only way we can have enough money to fund the women is we can't fund as many men anymore. And men scream, well, that's reverse sexism. You're discriminating against us to benefit the women. Well, the reality of it is that the athletic directors were lying. That is not what happened. If you look at the growth of men's sports since Title IX, they have definitely grown. They've not gotten smaller. We do know, and COVID was such a great illustration of this. During COVID, we would have athletic directors announce that I'm going to have to cut these jobs. I'm going to have to cut these programs because we're not getting any revenue right now. So our budget is out of whack. So we can't fund these things. So this happened at like Arizona State. I had a USA Today reporter called me, and I talked about this in the book. He called me up and he said, a couple months ago, they cut these positions in the athletic department. Then they were paying these people like $50,000, $60,000 a year. And they cut these positions. They said, we have a budget crisis. We can't afford this. And now our football team just lost by 9 touchdowns to our in-state rival. And the boosters have demanded that we fire the head coach. And that's going to cost us, because of the way the contract is written, it's going to cost like $20 million. He said, so why does the athletic department have $20 million today, but they didn't have $60,000 2 months ago? And I said, because what they're doing is they're making up a story for why it is they want to do something. I wish to cut these jobs. Why? Oh, I got to have a story that's going to make you think I'm not a bad person. My story is it's COVID. I got no money. Oh, okay. Well, it's not your fault then. Okay. Sorry, people, your job's gone, but I'm not a bad person. And then 2 months later, I got $20 million to fire the head coach. Where'd you get that money from? Well, I always had that money. Actually, we've always had money to pay for everybody, because it turns out my school is a multi-billion-dollar enterprise and I have money to pay for any damn thing I want to pay for. And you're like, so you were just lying? Yes, I was lying. And so we've had other schools. University of Cincinnati did this. They said, we have to cut the men's soccer program. And I looked up the number and I said, you said you spent $500,000 on that. Why do you have a budget price that requires that you cut the men's soccer program? You're paying individual football coaches more than $500,000. Why would you have to cut an entire program for $500,000? Why don't you just cut one coaching position? Oh, we can't do that. I mean, I need 7 tight end coaches. I mean, how are those tight ends going to learn without 7 coaches? You know, I made that comment on social media because I think there was a team that actually hired more than 1 tight end coach. I'm like, are we in a race with China to be the best at tight end technology? What the hell is that?
It is a very important position. Darren, you're about to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say, living in Texas, I can't imagine paying a football coach a bunch of money to do absolutely nothing so I can replace him with another football coach. Gig him.
Yes.
David, David, can I ask you, I want to, just to change topics, like you make this, before we leave the book, I have one more question. I want to move on to Caitlin Clark, the WNBA, because that's just such a hot topic right now. But the book is so good. Let's just try this one out. You make this fairly controversial proposition that advantages enjoyed by men, such as attendance, revenue, investment, and media coverage are, and this is your words, primarily due to a very long history of discrimination against women in sport, end quote. So I'm curious, what's the form of discrimination that you have in mind? That's the first part of the question. And the second one is, how do you go about proving this causal connection between discrimination and these disparate outcomes when there's all these other things that could be, affecting things as well?
We do know there is absolute discrimination at the beginning of the story, right? Women are actively banned. So we know that. We know that's where the story starts. So we go back in time, women are banned. And those bans, for instance, in England, women were banned from playing professional soccer up till 1972. So these bans are fairly recent in human history. We also know that after the bans were lifted at US colleges, they didn't fund them. I mean, they were actively not funding them. And when Title IX gets passed and they insist that you actually fund women's sports, we know also from history, the men reacted to that really badly. They were like, I don't want to be involved in that. We know the story of the University of Texas, where the athletic director was told, you have to have women's sports now. He said, I want you to hire a woman to be the athletic director just of women's sports. I don't want to hear about it. I don't want anyone telling me about this. I'm not doing that. And so that's obviously discrimination. So we don't fund it, we banned it, that's discrimination. And we also know from the history of men's sports that it takes time to build up a fan base. So if you didn't allow it to happen, well, you're not going to have a fan base today. So we know that. We also know when we look at the sports media coverage, it's heavily tilted towards men's sports. And that's the obvious explanation of that is most of the sports writers are men. I think there's a mythology that when men are deciding what to cover, that somehow they're doing a marketing survey. I wonder what we should cover. Let's ask the consumers. I did a little story at Forbes, and I was looking for something to write about, and I thought I wanted to illustrate this bias in the media. So if you look at every of the major sports websites, there are links at the top of all of them that have different pages. Here's the NFL page. Here's Major League Baseball page. So I asked this question. I said, how many of those pages are about women's sports? And I found an interesting thing. This was back in 2017. There were more links to sports about animals than there were links to sports about women. So there was like fishing links, dog shows links, horse racing links. And you're like, really? Dog shows? Fishing? How did fishing become a huge, you need a whole page on fishing? And I was talking to Noel Agas, one of my co-authors, about this, and she's a sport management professor. She said, well, yeah, when the old guy who runs the website was thinking about it, he's going, I like fishing. I want a page on fishing. You're like, you mean you don't do a survey? They want people watching, people are going to be clicking on your fishing links? Well, I will be. I want to hear reports on fishing. I like
all of our fishing aficionados just dropped off the podcast. They're no longer listening in protest. All right, I want to switch gears.
I recommend, if you love fishing and fishing television shows, there's a beautiful stand-up act by Brian Regan about the whole idea that you are watching fishing and what that means.
Yeah, I guess as we are not trolls, we won't be tweeting on fishing anytime soon, I imagine. But let me shift gears and go over to Caitlin Clark, because this topic right now is getting so much attention in the WNBA. And the first thing I want to ask you about, what, by the way, she, the most recent thing in the news is her being snubbed by the Olympic Committee. I don't know if you followed that or you have got thoughts on that. But let's just begin with this claim that Caitlin Clark invented the WNBA. All right. And I've seen it too, but I want to know who's peddling the myth and for what purpose? Why is it, and finally, why is it so important for you to bust up this myth?
Well, I think the Caitlin Clark story goes back to a change in the way in which NCAA women's basketball has been covered. So for a long time, the NCAA women's championship, they didn't cover really all the games in any way that was accessible. We all know, we should hopefully remember this. We all know about the bubble incident where the women were treated very differently during the pandemic than the men in terms of the weight room gap that Sedona Prince pointed out. And when they changed the coverage of women's college basketball, they made sure the games on the tournament were all broadcast and that the championships were now on ABC, which is a major network. Surprisingly, when you change where it's being shown, the audience increases dramatically. And then you had a Caitlin Clark story at that same time where she's breaking the record of Pete Maravich. And so that's the narrative that people are saying. And she's taking shots from the logo and people are impressed by that. So all these things happen at the same time. So suddenly a whole bunch of people know Caitlin Clark, they recognize Caitlin Clark, and you can't argue there's no Caitlin Clark fans. That would make no sense. There clearly are Caitlin Clark fans. So now the men who are trolling the WNBA are like, okay, first of all, we started with the assumption that Clay Travis said last year, there are no fans. Clearly, Caitlin Clark has arrived. There are fans. Therefore, it must be Caitlin Clark created all the fans. And I came along and I said, well, is it true? Okay, let's go back and look at it. Revenue in 2019, according to Bloomberg, there was a story from an WNBA source, was $100 million. And then 5 years later, before Caitlin Clark showed up, it was $200 million. It doubled in 5 years. That was before Caitlin Clark. Clearly, the league was growing, which is exactly what you'd expect. It's in its third decade. The NBA started growing in its third decade. Major League Baseball was growing in its third decade, fourth decade. That's when these things take off. So it's not surprising. So Caitlin Clark shows up and I'm like, that's not what's going on here, people. That there already was an established league. There already were fans here. Yes, Caitlin Clark has brought in more fans. That is true. But there were already fans. I went to an Aces Lynx game just a couple weeks ago in Las Vegas. It was sold out. There were clearly fans, and there was no Caitlin Clark in the building at all. We were watching totally different players, and we were all happy doing that.
I want to stick with the WNBA, and I want to get to this topic of the gender wage gap, right? Which I find just fascinating, and you calculate in the book what the players in the WNBA would be paid if they got the same wage share as men in the NBA. And the stat that I came across, I think in the New York Times, which might be your stat, by the way, is saying that the wage share for women players in the WNBA is 10%. The number is staggering to me because I know that's below what the college player share is. And it's below some other league that I can't mention on this on this podcast until the settlement is consummated. I was like, that is a high level of exploitation. So, and by comparison, I think it's 50% wage share in the NBA, but not just NBA, right? Most men's leagues, professional sports leagues, are at 50. So what is wrong with the WNBA? What needs to change? What are the few key levers that you would change to move this wage share up to normal, non-exploitative levels?
Well, so just a little bit of history of exploitation. If you go to European soccer, which does not, European sports do not have drafts, they do not have salary caps, they don't have payroll caps. All those things are illegal in the European Union. You're not allowed to have any of those. They get something like 60 to 70% of the revenue. So if you take away all the impediments, it's 6-7%. NBA has impediments. They get 50% of basketball related income. And so and the NFL is 40 to 50%, Major League Baseball is around 50%. WNBA comes along, their revenue is 200 million. They pay their players about 20 million. That's 10%. So it's like, wow, that's really low. And it's been really low forever. And there's no mechanism in the collective bargaining agreement that will legitimately link salary changes to revenue changes. There is some language about revenue sharing, but the thresholds that they would have to reach to put those in place are never going to be reached. So there's really no link between revenue and salaries. Salaries are fixed in dollar amounts. So as the revenue goes up, the share just keeps going down. It's now down to about 8%. And so the first, what you obviously would do is change the language of collective bargaining agreement and say, look, you got to do what you do for the men, link it to the revenue. The fundamental problem, though, is that they don't want to do that. Is that the NBA runs this show. I think this is important to recognize, is that there are 12 WNBA owners. They wanted to have charter flights for a long time for their players. It is uncomfortable for a woman who's 6'6" to be flying commercial. And so they wanted to have charter flights. The NBA said, no, we don't want to pay for that. And then suddenly when Caitlin Clark showed up, and they did a story that said Caitlin Clark is going to go from flying charters at the University of Iowa to flying commercial. What are we going to do about that? The WNBA announced on a day, we're not going to have charter flights for everybody. And I spoke to somebody in the WNBA about that. I said, when did you hear about that? Well, when you heard about that. I'm like, don't you have to hear about it first because you're the ones doing the travel plans? You would think so, wouldn't you? You would think they'd have to tell us first, but no, they did not. They just announced it because it was embarrassing for the league that Caitlin Clark could be flying commercial, so they didn't want to do that.
So there's a question about why that. I mean, there's a lot of exceptionalism with this, with Caitlin Clark, and I can't help but think of a couple of examples of this where really. There's gender discrimination in sports, but there's also perhaps some race discrimination. And let me give you an example of this, and let me see if you can. So there's a May 23rd essay in the New York Times by Josh Mendelson titled "Pay Caitlin Clark What She's Worth." And he writes, "Yet for reasons that astound me as both an NBA historian and a professor who teaches labor relations, and therefore the racial issue is lost on him, the WNBA has decided that Clark will be paid a salary of $76,535 in her first year. The rate reflects the maximum salary for a rookie under the year's collective bargaining agreement. That decision is both a choice and a missed opportunity." So my first question for you is, have you ever seen an essay titled "Pay X What She's Worth," where X is pick any one of the many exceptional Black players in the NBA, Alyssa Thomas, Jonquel Jones, Wilson? I mean, you can just go on and on. So seen an article like that?
No, it seems rather odd that you picked out the white player to get pissed off about. Yeah, it does seem really. The lack of self-awareness that you're doing that doesn't seem to click in their head. Like, do you know you're doing this? Do you know that that's what's going on in your head? It is the case that there have been articles written that Caitlin Clark should be paid extra money, but never anybody else. Caitlin Clark should be on charters. They weren't worried about when nobody else was. And it's important to recognize that these decisions it is true, they are choices. It is choices made by the NBA. This is in the book. One of I think it's the CEO of the Atlanta Dream, and I wrote this in an article. I think it was an article. I don't know where I wrote this, but it's in the book also. she made this comment to me, and this is the way she put it. The NBA owns half the league. The WNBA owners own half the league. She said, this is the way it works. If the 12 WNBA owners said they want to do something and the NBA said no, the answer is no. The NBA is the final arbitrator of what we do. They decide. If we decide to do something and they don't agree with us, then we don't get to do that. They overrule us. The NBA calls all the shots. So if you ask any question about what's the problem in the WNBA, why can't you fix it? The NBA is the one that can't fix it. Why? This is to illustrate the NBA's management of this. The story that the WNBA doesn't make a profit, that comes from the NBA. The NBA is the one who says that. Now, here's the point we make in the book. We have an entire chapter on why you never should say something as stupid as that about a growing league. But there's one obvious thing you would say, and the NBA itself knows this. The NBA, when it was starting, did not do this. You don't say about a growing league that you're not successful because you want your fans to commit to you. So you got to say that you're going to be here. If you tell them there's no profit, they'll leave, right? Early in the NBA history, we have a memo. This is in a book on NBA history. We have a memo from the NBA commissioner in the early 50s to the team. And what the memo says is, a lot of you are actually telling the media your exact attendance numbers, and we want you to cut that out. Lie. If you got 2,000 fans, say there's 4,000 fans. If you got 3,000, say it's 5,000. They can't count. Make a number that's plausible. Make it sound like we're doing well. Okay, why weren't they doing early on in the NBA history? Why weren't they issuing press releases saying, the NBA is not making a profit. Don't know what the hell we're doing here. Because you don't have any fans. You got to get people to show up. Okay, and so they knew not to do that. But Adam Silver inherited an NBA that was already successful, so he didn't know any of those lessons. And so he is actually going to the media and telling them the WNBA isn't profitable. Why? It's a labor negotiation strategy. It helps them. They want to do that to control their labor costs, which they've done amazingly well at. They're paying 10%, so they've done really, really well at that. There is going to be a new collective agreement negotiated next year. I'm not optimistic the women can dramatically change their pay because they don't have a lot of bargaining power. It is still a very small league relative to the size of the NBA. If the WNBA players walked off the job, I don't know that the NBA owners would care. And so if you can't threaten your employer with a loss of revenue by walking off the job, then you don't have any bargaining power.
So you raise an interesting point here because, the argument for wage exceptionalism is actually a way perhaps to also bypass collective bargaining, because you're trying to suggest that there should be something in the collective bargaining agreement for exceptional players. And that would
I think there should be something like bargaining for all the players.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. But the thing is that in order for this to change, the NBA would have to voluntarily agree to change it. And to me, we both know in the history of businesses do not voluntarily just give their workers a big chunk of change because they feel like, hey, I like you. That's not a very common outcome. You typically have to have something that you're threatening them with. And it is the case that that people in business make up stories that they just don't have no money. I like during the pandemic, well, before the pandemic, remember there was the whole story about $15 minimum wage? And we heard a lot of fast food restaurants say, I can't pay $15, I'd go out of business. And then the pandemic hits and you see ads, $15. Well, you said you couldn't pay that. Well, nobody's showing up to work, so I'm paying $15. But you said you go out of business if you did that, so clearly you can't do that, right? Well, it turns out I was lying about that. It turns out I could the whole time.
Only because we're a little pressed on time, I want to switch over. I think we've picked on the WNBA enough. Let's pick a little bit on the NCAA for our last 5 minutes. Is that okay? And I want to talk about the NCAA and women's sports, but is the NCAA doing everything that it can to promote women's sports? I mean, what are they doing right? What are they doing wrong? Why don't you weigh in on that?
There's a lot of wrong.
Okay, what wrong?
I think this is great. I think this is the last story we put in the book, or one of the last stories. All right, so the NCAA they negotiated this giant men's college basketball contract, which gives the NCAA like $1 billion a year for the broadcasting rights to the NCAA men. And then people noted about the women's basketball, and they said the rights to the women's basketball tournament were bundled with the rights to something around 30 other sports tournaments. And the entire bundle was given to ESPN for like $34 million. So it was $1 million per sport. And somebody wrote, the NCAA hired a lawyer to investigate their gender practices after the weight room gap incident during the pandemic. And they said they hired an independent consultant. They said the women's basketball rights by themselves are worth between 80 to 120 million. And so you clearly dramatically undervalued this. Well, the NCAA said, well, we got to fix that. So then they renegotiated with ESPN, and they came out this last January with a brand new deal. This new deal will pay them $115 million for the same big bundle of sports. So they went from 34 to 115 million. And then they said in the press release about it, they said 65 million of that is just women's basketball. So the other sports are all going to be about 50 million. And there's like 35 to 40 other sports. So it turns out that for all the other sports, they're still getting a little bit more than $1 million per sport, which means that they were getting $1 million per sport for volleyball, which gets big ratings, and women's softball, which gets big ratings. Okay. And after they were chastised for not negotiating, they're still getting just $1 million for those sports. So you're like, okay, you totally blew it on that. And the NCAA's defense, I think, would be, well, people were screaming about women's basketball, so we focused on that. Oh, okay. Didn't have volleyball players post videos about being discriminated against. Okay. Well, even the women's basketball, though, now, you look at that deal. 65 million for women's basketball. Men get $1 billion. Well, let's do the television ratings. They did the television ratings this last year, which got bigger television ratings. Well, it turns out women's basketball got bigger television ratings. Now, you might think that's a Caitlin Clark thing. Well, perhaps, but we have to understand something about the nature of men and women's basketball in college now. Men's basketball has one and done. This is something that was true about the NBA draft this week. How many players in the NBA draft have any basketball fans ever heard of? Who the hell are these people? Okay, they played 1 year in college or they played in Europe. You're like, who the hell is that person? Oh, they're great. Are they? I've never heard of them. And then the WNBA draft, who's getting drafted? I know who Caitlin Clark is. I know who Angel Reese. I know who these people are. I've seen them for years. They don't have one and done. So we can expect going forward that women's college basketball is going to keep getting very high ratings because the players are all recognizable. Paige Bucher is going to be in the tournament next year. We've all heard of her. She's going to be playing again. And so you're going to see this going forward, but there's going to be this disparity. Those deals are locked in. Men are going to be getting $1 billion. Women are getting less than 100 million. And you're like, but the ratings are similar. How did you negotiate that? Well, when it comes to the negotiating for the women, the NCAA, again, let's compare this to what they did for the men. NBA, what did the NBA do in their recent deal? They went and they talked to who? Everybody. They talked to everybody. Everybody give us a bid. What do you got? Right? TNT lost it because people outbid them. Who did the NCAA talk to about the women's sports? ESPN. Who else did I talk to? ESPN. You mean you negotiated with nobody? Just one person?
That's hardly a bid. But I want to interrupt and say there's a, and the NCAA, those of you who don't know me, I can be sarcastic many times of the year. So the NCAA isn't doing everything wrong. I mean, they have this partnership with Meta to help women athletes enhance their name, image, and likeness. According to the announcement, quote, participants will have the opportunity to form direct relationships with the Meta experts who will provide product and business best practices. Participants also will make valuable connections with other student athletes and industry professionals and receive exclusive access to various NCAA events. Isn't that nice? And or is this a trap that we should be worried about?
Well, I think they have a habit of doing little things that may not mean a whole lot, and then ignoring the big things that mean a whole lot.
Well, with Meta involved, I kind of wonder if it isn't a big thing that's hidden as a little thing that might be. I'm naturally suspicious. So,
well, the thing about it is, this is something that's really hard. Is that I want to make this note about the NIL deals. NCAA deals for men are clearly often about just acquiring players to make the team win better. That has nothing to do with marketing. NIL deals for women are about social media reach. I don't know that you need a consulting company for a woman who already has 1 million Instagram followers for her to get an NIL deal. They already want to make a deal with her. She's got 1 million Instagram followers. So the women who are marketable are marketable. They don't need the consultant in the first place. And I think, that's the issue that I think, should be explored in more detail is why are the men getting bigger deals than the women when they don't have the same marketability? Because a freshman coming in college football doesn't have 1 million Instagram followers yet. Nobody's ever heard of this person. And so there's something going on there too.
Excellent. Well, David, I think we're going to call it a wrap there. This has been fascinating, and you're not only a great writer but a great speaker too. I've really enjoyed the show. Darren, I hope you had a good time. David, I hope you had a good time. And get ready, we'll break the internet when we post this thing. So it was great talking.
That'll be great. All right, guys. All right.
Bye.